Good afternoon, everybody. This is Luke Forster at NYSERDA. Thank you for attending the webinar. It's about time to kick it off. We will be presenting today on the Distributed Solar Roadmap, which was recently filed by NYSERDA and New York DPS. Thank you for joining. Can we go to the next slide, please? A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First of all, today's webinar is indeed being recorded. The slides and the actual recording file will be posted on NYSERDA's Resources for Contractors webpage. It typically takes us a few days to submit the IT ticket and for them to actually post the files. So I expect that this will be up early next week. Everyone has been muted on their entry to the webinar. We have about 160 people so far, and we anticipate more joining as the call goes on. So if you do have a question, we will not be unmuting you. Rather, please use the Q&A kind of chat box in the WebEx window. I see some people have already used that, so I know it's accessible. We will address the questions all together at the end of the webinar. We will not be stopping in sections for questions. We're rolling it all into the end. We're going to save roughly half of an hour for interactive Q&A. We will answer as many questions as we possibly can in that time. Those questions we do not get to, we will post a file afterwards with all of those questions and answers. Next slide, please. Here's the agenda today. I'll provide a quick introduction to people on the call. My name is Luke Forster. I'm a senior business analyst on NYSERDA's Distributed Energy Resources team. I'm heavily involved in the New York Sun program, as well as NYSERDA's battery energy storage program. I was involved in the development of the roadmap. I'll be presenting about 2/3 of the content today before passing it off to a few colleagues. That's to say, I am not alone on the call. We have a very wide and qualified team from both NYSERDA and DPS on the line today. And this team will be helping answer all of the questions that come in. From New York Department of Public Service, we have Marco Padula, Warren Myers, Justin Fung, John Garvey, and Zerai Hagos. Gentlemen, thank you for joining today. And on the NYSERDA side, we have our Vice President of Distributed Energy Resources, David Sandbank. We have our Assistant Director, Shia Mehta, Christopher Rogers, Sal Graven. There may be others as well, so I apologize if I missed anybody. So first, I will provide some context around what this solar roadmap is, why it was written, what the timeline is around it, and what the next steps are. Then I'll dive a bit into the content of the roadmap itself. I'll be covering the proposed megawatt block design expansion and some of the proposed incentive levels and program rules. And then I'll pass the microphone over to my two colleagues. First, our team lead and program manager, Max Joel, will be speaking a little bit about the solar energy equity framework and in the way these programs serve disadvantaged communities and LMI households. And then our colleague, Sarah Jayanthi, will be speaking about a new proposed program involved in there. Once they finish speaking, we'll circle back for Q&A and we'll answer as many as we can in the time we have. Again, this webinar is being recorded and we are going to run until about 2:30 today. Next slide, please. So this is part 2 in a 2-webinar series. The first part we presented on Tuesday, February 1st, 2 days ago. It's essentially the same content in both of these 2 webinars, but whereas Tuesday's was geared more towards the New York Sun proposed program design and some of the details about the proposed new incentives, today's webinar focuses a bit more heavily on the solar energy equity framework and the related questions around that topic. So roughly the same content, but more of a heavy focus on disadvantaged communities in the SEIF today. Both webinars will be recorded and both will be posted, as mentioned, on the Resources for Contractors page. Next slide, please. And next slide. So a little bit of context around what the solar roadmap is and why it was developed. As many of you are well aware, New York has an existing mandate to develop 6 gigawatts of distributed solar by the year 2025. And by distributed solar, we're talking about projects 5 megawatts AC and smaller. Under that umbrella category, we have single-family residential, we have multifamily projects, we have small commercial, we have larger commercial industrial projects, as well as all of New York State's community solar. So the good news is New York has made fantastic progress towards that 6 gigawatt goal. Of that 6 gigawatts, about 95% of it is either already built or at an advanced stage of development. By advanced stage of development, I mean a project is in the pipeline, it has its municipal permits, it's gone through its Caesar study, and it's made its 25% utility upgrade payment. So we're very confident that the state will hit and that 6 gigawatt goal very likely ahead of schedule before the end of 2025. Other good news, distributed solar costs have dropped steeply over the past several years. While solar employment in the market has also increased year by year, we're currently at roughly 12,000 solar jobs in New York State. So it's a great source of employment and good paying jobs. However, the flip side is that growth came very rapidly and most of the existing incentives are fully tapped out. In the New York Sun Megawatt Block program, the Upstate Commercial Industrial Block was fully allocated very early in 2021. The Community Credit and Community Adder, which are incentives specific towards community solar projects, have been fully allocated. And we're at a point now where the industry and in the wider solar stakeholder group is saying, well, we're finishing that 6 gigawatts. What comes next? How should we think about additional project development in the years to come? So to answer that question of what do we want to do next, NYSERDA and Department of Public Service developed this distributed solar roadmap proposing a recommended pathway towards that 10 gigawatt by 2030 goal. A very important item to note, this roadmap is essentially a petition. All of the recommendations and proposed incentives that I'm going to be discussing today are not, in fact, set in stone. This roadmap is going before New York State Public Service Commission, which has the option of approving it, modifying it, and approving it, or denying it. We'll speak a little bit more about that policy pathway and the timeline involved in that on a later slide. But I just want to make sure we're on the same page, that this is a proposed program extension that we're talking about at this point. And the roadmap does explore various policy options to achieve that incremental goal of 4 gigawatts. When I'm talking about an incremental goal of 4 gigawatts, I'm talking about the new proposed goal of 10 gigawatts by 2030 minus the existing goal of 6 gigawatts by 2025. So we're essentially adding another 4 gigawatts onto that goal. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a snapshot of where New York State currently stands. Some of the data is a few months old because it takes a little amount of time to get the updated completion data from the utilities. You'll see we have a grand total of 6 gigawatts, the 6 gigawatt target, broken out by segment and broken out by part of the state. The segments are residential, typically single-family residential projects, non-residential, which are smaller commercial projects, 750 kilowatts and smaller, Long Island is broken out in its own bucket. I'll discuss that, why that is, a little bit later. And you'll see that second from the bottom, we have Upstate C&I, which stands for Commercial Industrial, and that includes community solar, also known as CDG. So a couple takeaways here. Residential and non-residential projects are providing meaningful contributions towards that 6 gigawatt goal. But over half of that 6 gigawatts is coming from the upstate community solar projects. You'll see that the blue segments of the bars are already built, and they have permission to operate from the utility. These projects are essentially turned on and operational. The yellow sections of the bars are projects that are at that mature stage of development. They've received NYSERDA incentives, they've received their permits, and they're working through the construction and the utility interconnection processes. And the gray sections of the bars represents existing capacity in the New York Sun program that has not been awarded yet. And that's typically for residential projects and some of the smaller non-residential segments. So all this is to say, we've made enormous progress towards that 6 gigawatt goal, and it's time to take a good hard look at what comes next. Next slide, please. Here's another kind of snapshot. This shows progress over the past 8 years. All of the data underlying this visual is tied to commercial/industrial projects. So projects between 750 kilowatts DC and 7.5 megawatts DC, so larger projects. You'll see the yellow dots in a descending pattern. They represent the project price per watt dropping year by year. Part of that is equipment hardware costs dropping. Part of that beneficial change also comes from a reduction in soft costs and in administrative costs and customer acquisition. You'll see that the gray line represents a reduction in the NYSERDA incentive over time from 83 cents per watt in 2014 to about 25 cents per watt in 2021. So NYSERDA's incentive has been reduced over time, even though the NYSERDA incentive is essentially covering more aspects of projects than it ever did before. We do have the community adder, and we do have adders for projects located on landfills, brownfields, or projects that serve DACs. I also want to point out that each bar is broken into a light blue and a dark blue segment. The dark blue represents community solar, and the light blue represents other types of projects in that size category. So essentially, we're seeing that community solar has really taken off to a majority of the megawatts installed per year in the commercial industrial segment. So a couple trends: project costs are dropping, incentives have dropped accordingly. Overall, commercial industrial deployment has increased year by year, and community solar is forming a larger part of that portfolio. Next slide, please. So the release of the solar roadmap comes downstream from a series of technical conferences. NYSERDA and DPS jointly hosted these technical conferences last spring. It was a 2-day event conducted remotely. On the initial day, NYSERDA and DPS gave a presentation that touched on some of the items I just talked about, where the industry stands, progress through the existing incentive programs, deployment levels per year, current jobs involved in solar. And NYSERDA and DPS also suggested that if there were an expanded megawatt goal, additional incentives would be needed. And that presentation really honed in on ways that the value stack could be adjusted to further support projects. A lot of the discussion was around if and how and should the E value, the environmental value, and the value stack, how that could be changed to better support projects and better account for the clean energy benefits of renewables. So that was the first day, April 21st. 2 weeks later, the second day was essentially an opportunity for stakeholders and other parties to respond. There were presentations from the joint utilities, from Borrego Solar, and there was a very thorough one from the clean energy parties. The CEP is essentially a group of solar developers and stakeholders. And the clean energy parties group really stressed the importance of a transparent, simple, and a quickly implemented program change. They essentially suggested that rather than redesigning an entirely new program to support solar, the existing incentive structure could just be tweaked a little bit. So all of the comments discussed at that stakeholder technical conference were really incorporated in the thought process and in the design of the solar roadmap. Next slide, please. Okay, a little bit on the process. So on our end, NYSERDA and DPS have been busily working on the solar roadmap for much of the calendar year 2021. The roadmap was eventually filed, I believe it was December 17th, right before Christmas break. And the roadmap involved extensive research and analysis. We took a look at everything we could think of, including how many projects are currently in the development queue, what are current and projected future project costs and customer acquisition costs. We took a pretty thorough look at different business models, including community solar, remote crediting, community choice aggregation, on-site solar. And we did some very extensive financial modeling and analysis as well. If you're interested in some of those assumptions that we looked at, that's all captured pretty neatly in Appendix B of the roadmap document. If you haven't taken a look at the roadmap yet, I believe my colleague Sarah dropped a link to it in the chat. You can also find it by looking at the DPS website, and we will have a link in the slides as well. The solar roadmap ultimately recommended a goal of 10 gigawatts of solar by 2030. That's consistent with Governor Hochul's expanded goal, which he announced in September 21. Next slide, please. So as I said, the roadmap has been filed for about a month and a half at this point. It's currently open for public comment through March 7th. Comments can be filed on the Department of Public Service website. I've got the case number listed here. For those of you that spend a lot of time on the DMM, I'll point out that the roadmap is not on the VETR case. It's not on the Clean Energy Fund case. They essentially created a new DMM page for this. So you won't find it on any of those spots. You can simply just do a Google search for New York DPS and a case number, or you can go to the DPS page and drop that case number in their search box. Again, we've got a link to that at the end of the slides as well. So as I said, this is open for comments through March 7th. I encourage you to file whatever comments you have. After that March 7th date, the Public Service Commission and Department of Public Service will review those comments. And then the PSC has the option of approving the roadmap and issuing an order. They could deny it outright, or they could approve it with changes or modifications. If and when it is approved, NYSERDA will update the megawatt block implementation plan. We will solidify the plans for the updated program design, and we would then launch the program as quickly as possible. The good news is it should be pretty quick for us to roll out an expanded program once that approval comes. We've already got the Salesforce portal, the megawatt block webpage, and all of our contractor resources. So NYSERDA is really looking at this more of a program extension than rolling out a new program from scratch. Next slide, please. So now we'll speak a little bit about the content of that roadmap document and some of its implications. Next slide, please. So the roadmap really cast a very wide net in examining different ways that solar could be supported. We looked at, should any incentive be paid upfront after project completion, essentially the way it is done now with New York Sun, or should an incentive, be based in, should it be baked into the value stack and paid out per kilowatt hour over the project term, similar to the way the community credit and MTC were done. We looked at should the incentive just be simply set at a certain level by the policymakers, or should it be determined on an auction-based approach where projects bid in their requested incentive. We also took a look at should the incentive essentially be fixed at a static level for a given project, or could it be indexed to the energy and capacity markets. NYSERDA's Tier 1 large-scale renewables program has an auction-based approach, and they also have the indexed REC offering, whereby projects essentially bid in for a certain amount of incentive plus energy plus capacity, and that structure seems to work pretty well for the larger projects. So we examined all of those items. Certainly each option has pros and cons, and we do have those sort of described out in the roadmap and in Appendix A. However, after all of our analysis and discussion, NYSERDA and DPS concluded that the best path forward to that 10 gigawatt goal appeared to be extending the existing New York Sun megawatt block incentive with administratively set upfront incentives. A couple pros to that: it has a proven track record for transparency. There's also a lot of flexibility in the design. For those of you that have participated in the program for a number of years, you'll see that we typically release the incentive blocks 1 or 2 at a time, and that gives us the flexibility to change later blocks and adjust the incentives up a little higher or lower based on market changes and market conditions. It would also be very simple for NYSERDA to implement an expansion to the megawatt block. It wouldn't require a lot of program design, web work, IT work. We could simply roll out an extension of the existing program. The auction-based approach had some very serious incompatibilities with the utility standardized interconnection requirements, and there was doubts as to what the actual savings could be for an indexed incentive. So I won't go any more into that topic. So let's move on to the next slide, please. The roadmap does recommend some changes or improvements to interconnection policy. Again, I'm not going to do a deep dive here. There's a bit more content in the roadmap itself. Essentially, the roadmap recommends that the utility planning process include the 10 gigawatt goal if approved in the utility planning documents, and an expansion of the cost sharing 2.0 framework. Let's move on to the next slide, please. The roadmap also recommends that there be a prevailing wage requirement for projects above 1 megawatt AC. Right now, prevailing wage applies to projects in the large scale sphere, which is 5 megawatts AC. So we're proposing that that cap be lowered to 1 megawatt. In order to assist with that transition to prevailing wage, the proposed budget does have some incentive funds to offset that higher cost of labor to allow projects to move ahead. Additionally, there's the recommendation that projects that meet a certain milestone before the date of the filing of the roadmap would not be impacted. We essentially wouldn't want to apply a new requirement to projects that are already significantly far along in the development process. So this would just be towards newer projects. Let's move on down to the next slide, please. Here's a bit of a visual describing how that 4 gigawatt total is broken down across sector and across the state. So you see on the bottom, we add up to 4,000 megawatts. The bulk of that, about 2,943 megawatts, would come from megawatt scale projects located upstate. Much of that we expect is community solar. There is a carve out for projects located in the Con Edison territory. For those of you who don't live downstate, the Con Ed territory is essentially the 5 boroughs of New York City, plus much of Westchester County. Development downstate in Con Ed is generally pricier than upstate because land acquisition is more difficult, labor is a bit more expensive, and the price of doing business close to New York City generally drives the projects up. Additionally, it's very difficult to find large available plots of land or open roofs. So we see that smaller project development in Con Ed is crucial towards meeting that goal. So with that in mind, we broke out that target for Con Edison of 450 megawatts into essentially single family residential projects, small commercial projects, less than 1 megawatt DC direct current, and larger Con Edison projects above 1 megawatt DC. And we're specifying separate incentive rates for those residential, small commercial, and large commercial projects as well. Additionally, we think that about 600 megawatts could be built in Long Island and a little bit of upstate unincentivized projects. That would round out the 4,000 megawatt total. In discussions with Long Island Power Authority, they indicate that 560 megawatts of new Long Island projects could likely be built without additional incentives. But if funding is required for those Long Island projects, that would be coming from non-clean energy fund sources. So that funding for Long Island is essentially outside the scope of the budget proposed in this roadmap. I know I went through that pretty quickly. If you have a question, just drop that in the Q&A box and we will get to that at the end. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve that 4 gigawatt target, NYSERDA in the roadmap is requesting a budget of $1,474 million in New York Sun funding. It is broken out here a couple different ways. So about 420 million of that 1474 would go towards megawatt block incentives and siting adders for projects in Con Edison. That is a very significant portion of the budget going to projects exclusively down towards New York City. About 400 million would go for megawatt block incentives for upstate projects. And about 179 million would go towards community adder for community solar projects and siting adders such as the landfill and brownfield adder for projects that could be installed throughout the state, either upstate or in Con Ed. We've also got 239 million in that budget request to assist in the transition to prevailing wage. And the roadmap proposes that this budget could be collected from ratepayers over a multi-year period going to 2030. Next slide, please. All right, here's another roll-up of that budget to the 1474 level. You'll see all of the incentives listed together come up to 999 million. That's a combination of the upstate, Con Ed, and statewide incentive elements. 239 million to assist the transition to prevailing wage. And there's another $207 million for what we call the Solar Energy Equity Framework. Max and Sarah will speak a little bit more about that, but those are essentially programs and projects that support disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. A little bit on the ratepayer impact. 1.4 million, is certainly a significant budget. That comes to roughly $71 per month per household electric bill over the 11-year period. The next slide, please. I'm trying to go light on the detail here so we have significant time for the SEIF content. There are a lot of benefits in the proposed program expansion. By going from 6 gigawatts to 10 gigawatts, we would leverage about $4.4 billion in customer and developer private investment, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 64 million tons over the project life, bring direct bill savings to about 127,000 New Yorkers, create 6,000 jobs, and the incremental 4 gigawatts is enough electricity to power about 700,000 New Yorker homes. Next slide, please. I've just got one slide here breaking out some details for Upstate, and the next slide breaks out some details for the Con Edison territory. The proposed budget supports about 2.9 gigawatts of new commercial industrial scale projects upstate. We're proposing an initial block of 800 megawatts, very large block, at an incentive rate of 17 cents per watt. We're proposing enough community adder at 7 cents per watt to support about 70% of that 2943 megawatts. So in other words, we're planning on enough community adder so that 70% of the new upstate capacity could be community solar. The balance, 30%, would either be remote credited or projects located at the customer site. The proposed prevailing wage adder is 12.5 cents per watt for projects that would fall under that new prevailing wage requirement. And we are proposing extending the landfill and brownfield adder at its current level of 15 cents per watt. These incentives do stack. So for instance, if you had a community solar project located on a landfill using prevailing wage, that could conceivably receive each of these incentive elements. Next slide, please. Similar breakdown, but for projects located in Con Edison. Base incentive, you'll see it's different for larger projects, 75 cents a watt. For smaller projects, $1.30 per watt. And for residential projects, at 15 cents per watt. We spent a lot of time and a lot of analysis taking a look at historic and average project costs, future price trends, in the way that project development costs and revenue really vary by project size. It's sort of counterintuitive that single-family residential projects, which are the smallest, would need the smallest incentive, but they are able to really sort of get the most bang for the buck out of the New York City property tax abatement benefit. And there's also sort of fewer transaction costs to building a project on a residential rooftop. For instance, there's not a roof lease from a third-party commercial entity. Likewise, we saw that there was a significant and real step down in project cost per watt between projects under a megawatt and over a megawatt. So that data sort of informed the decision to have separate incentive rates for residential, small commercial, and larger commercial projects. In the roadmap, we're also proposing a community adder of 10 cents a watt for 70% of those new commercial projects, prevailing wage adder, and continuing the landfill and brownfield adder. One final element that we forgot to put on the slide, I apologize, is a continuation of the parking canopy and rooftop canopy adders, which are currently available to commercial projects in Con Edison territory. I believe the current incentive rate for them is 20 cents per watt. Can I go to the next slide, please? That's it for me, folks. I'm going to pass you off to our team lead and program manager, Mr. Max Joel. He'll be talking a bit about the Solar Energy Equity Framework. Max, I'll leave this in your capable hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for that very clear and concise review of what is a very long and complex document in the roadmap. So terrific work. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Max Joel. As Luke said, I'm the team lead for New York Sun, and I'll be introducing the Solar Energy Equity Framework before handing things off to my colleague, Sarah Jayanthi. So the Solar Energy Equity Framework is already in place. It was initially proposed in 2019 and enacted in 2020 by the Public Service Commission's order expanding the New York Sun program to what is now its current 6 gigawatt size. So in the 10 gigawatt roadmap, we proposed that 40% of the new incremental capacity, 1,600 megawatts, be targeted towards the same customer groups that are currently covered within the SEIF. That is low to moderate income residents, regulated affordable housing, disadvantaged communities, and environmental justice communities. And I'll note that on a later slide, I'll discuss in more detail the interaction between the Solar Energy Equity Framework and the formal disadvantaged communities definitions that are now under or will soon be under public consideration. So of this 1,600 megawatts, 1,357 megawatts are within the new New York Sun incentives that are proposed. That very precise number is simply 40% of the total incentivized capacity in the investor-owned utilities area, referencing back to a slide Luke covered previously that noted that a portion of the new 4 gigawatt target was broken out for Long Island. So this 1,357 megawatts is not inclusive of that Long Island number, as again, as Luke noted, that would be incentivized and managed through a different structure. Now, for these new SEIF incentives, we proposed $207 million in dedicated additional incentives and funding for the SEIF. So I'll underline the word additional. As many on the webinar may be familiar, most of the current SEIF programs are adder incentives. Projects that qualify receive additional incentives on top of what we might call the base New York Sun megawatt block incentives. So our calculation is that approximately $400 million of these base incentives would also go to projects that qualify within the SEIF. So currently there are several programs already in place. I'll be going into more detail about those in just a moment. We are proposing that those programs be continued, and also that we focus at least half of the new capacity towards low and moderate income residential customers who can receive direct electric bill savings. So a couple points there. I'll note that on this slide we refer to percentage of the capacity, so per percentage of megawatts. It would be a slightly different calculation if you were trying to calculate the those direct electric bill savings, which of course to an individual customer is the benefit they receive. It's not spelled out on this slide, but it is spelled out in the roadmap that we are proposing a minimum 10% savings target for customers covered within the solar energy equity framework, whereas we have assumed, and this is an assumption, not a requirement, that savings for market rate customers outside of the SEIF, will be about 5% electric bill savings. So you could estimate that the percentage of the total benefits calculated as bill savings going to SEIF customers would actually be significantly greater than 40% because of that deeper savings on a per customer or per project level. So you know, that as we start talking about actual benefits, that's important to keep in mind. As my colleague Sarah will be presenting in just a moment, we're also moving forward with a co-design process for programmatic support for community-led solar projects, and we'll have a lot more on that in just a minute. Finally, certainly the SEIF, New York Sun, the 10 gigawatt goal is not happening in a vacuum. I know many people on this call have been involved with the broader statewide energy affordability policy, the LMI portfolio that is managed by NYSERDA and the utilities. So through the proposed expansion to 10 gigawatts, the proposed extension in time to 2030, we intend to really seize the opportunity for greater coordination with the statewide efforts at building electrification, heat pump deployment, energy efficiency deployment, and energy storage for disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So a quick review of the current SEIF programs. Now again, the roadmap proposes extending all of these programs. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're frozen in place. We certainly welcome at all times, but especially as part of this process, feedback, comments from stakeholders about how these programs could be improved, altered, expanded upon, or changed really in any way. So very briefly, we currently have in place a added incentive for low and moderate income homeowners who install solar on their roofs. That adder brings the incentive up to 80 cents a watt in the IOUs and 40 cents a watt on Long Island. Likewise, we have an incentive for regulated multifamily affordable housing that increases the total incentive to $1 a watt for the first 200 kilowatts of capacity, and has now been increased to $2 a watt for community solar projects serving Con Ed that do not have the community credit. We also are proposing to continue a very successful program, the Affordable Solar and Storage Pre-Development and Technical Assistance Program. These are grants to community-based planning and pre-development work. There's grants to affordable housing providers, nonprofit organizations that are deploying, developing, planning projects that serve disadvantaged communities and LMI households and affordable housing. We have about actually more than 30 active initiatives around the state. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in that program to visit our website. There's both more information about how organizations can apply, but also archived webinars where we have a number of the current projects presenting their work and sharing their knowledge, and gives you a real sense of all the exciting stuff happening around the state. Finally, the Inclusive Community Solar Adder. This provides additional incentives for community solar projects serving low and moderate income customers, as well as affordable housing, nonprofits and public facilities serving disadvantaged communities. Now, as many people on the call may be aware, we just had our first round of the ICSA launched in July of last year. All the funding for projects upstate has been committed, We are through the program expecting more than 500 megawatts of capacity serving those target customer groups to be developed. So a major success from that perspective. It is also something of a natural breakpoint, meaning that, as noted here, the future ICSA structure and rules incentive levels will be adjusted, certainly based on what we've learned from this first round, but there's also a great opportunity for stakeholders to, in their comments on the roadmap, identify ways that that program can change or evolve or be reinforced. Next slide, please. So I want to speak for a few minutes to the kind of the Venn diagram, the similarities and differences between the targets of the SEIF and the designated disadvantaged communities. Now, the process for designating disadvantaged communities was, of course, established in the CLCPA. However, the timing of the SEIF, which again was proposed in 2019, was initially prior to the publication of the interim disadvantaged communities designations that we have now. So, you know, for those of you sort of first seeing or getting a refresher on the SEIF, you'll see a lot of overlap with some of the targets of the disadvantaged communities designations, but not a perfect overlap. So these two processes have really continued to move forward in parallel. There is a process underway to finalize the disadvantaged communities criteria, including mapping the final disadvantaged communities under the Climate Act. So those criteria, those draft criteria, will be published very shortly this month. They will go through a public process and are anticipated to be finalized in mid-2022. Again, that's a parallel process to the 10 gigawatt roadmap. So let's just look in a little more depth at some of the distinctions between what has to date been implemented through the CEF and what is proposed to continue in the 10 gigawatt roadmap versus some aspects of the designated DACs. So the and really here I'm focusing on the geographical aspect. I believe in the draft DACs that are being published, there are some non-geographical criteria. But on a geographical basis, SEF funding eligibility is generally based on the individual customer versus where they reside or are located. So with the SEF programs that I've described, as a general rule, we've tried to trace back who's receiving that electric cost savings benefit on the bills. So for example, and probably the most significant example, projects benefiting LMI residents who live outside of DACs have been eligible for SEF funding. That also goes for regulated affordable housing outside of DACs. In contrast, projects benefiting upper income residents, that, you know, this might be rooftop solar, for example, on someone's residence, or large commercial customers who are still located in a DAC census tract. Those customers are not currently eligible for SEF funding. And you know, this is really being presented as sort of details and observation. It's not meant to be a value judgment on the DAC process or the SEF process. Rather, it's explanatory, as you know, many stakeholders are, of course, very interested in this and may want to present comments on how they on how the two things line up, or how the SEF should potentially be changed to align in different ways with the final DACs. I'll note as another kind of data point that well, we've just had the opportunity to run our geographic data on our project database with the draft criteria DACs. And that analysis found, and this is preliminary, but I think relatively reliable, that 22.9% of past residential rooftop installations are located in the draft DACs. So that's very encouraging. Of course, that represents about 26,000 projects, and I think really reflects some major steps forward in the accessibility of rooftop residential solar. But I'll also note that we only have about 1,000 projects that have received our added incentive specifically for LMI households. Now that certainly doesn't mean that projects that didn't receive that adder are, one, either not, very valuable and important projects, or two, are not actually serving LMI residents. There's all sorts of reasons why a homeowner or a project wouldn't have come through one of those programs. However, it does point to, again, just underline that those certain distinctions between the focus of the SEIF and the geographic boundaries of the designated DACs. Some folks may be noticing that I'm only speaking to residential rooftop projects here. We don't, as of yet, have the same level of reliability of data on community solar subscribers who are very rapidly coming to outnumber residential rooftop solar customers. That is something we're actively working on with our evaluation and analysis, and of course really central to the SEIF strategy. So my final note here in this discussion is that we certainly have developed some SEF programs and aspects that are very much targeted to the designated DACs. The pre-development grants, I think in a lot of ways, are first and foremost. Those are really primarily place-based initiatives, and we do prioritize funding for DACs. And again, there's great resources on the website. I'll just also mention we do have a streamlined eligibility process for DAC residents, and have expanded eligibility for that adder for projects that serve nonprofits within DACs. And again, we're at a natural breakpoint for the ICSA. Depending on how the Commission resolves this 10 gigawatt process, we may have final DAC criteria approved very similar in a very similar time frame to the sort of 10 gigawatt roadmap moving forward, and potentially a relaunch of the ICSA. So this is again, just a fruitful area, I think, for comments from stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, and at this point, I will turn things over to my colleague, Sarah Jayanthi. Thank you very much, Sarah.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Max. So hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Jayanthi, and I am a project manager on the New York Sun team. We're excited to share that NYSERDA is actually planning to launch a co-design effort to build a program that supports the development of community-led and community-owned solar in underserved communities. This co-design will run 6 to 9 months, and the goal of the effort is to create a program that supports community-developed solar projects in New York State. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. We'll be selecting the co-design participants through a process that will be announced, and those participants will be collaborating directly with NYSERDA for the 6 to 9 month period. They will be working closely with us to identify barriers that are currently impeding community solar or community-led solar development in the state, and help NYSERDA develop a possible list of solutions to those identified barriers. We are releasing this program in collaboration with NYSERDA's Energy and Climate Equity team, and we anticipate that the release of this program will happen in spring of 2022. The last thing I just wanted to note that this co-design effort is happening in parallel to the roadmap. It is not dependent on anything that comes out of the roadmap. This is a program that we have been planning to launch. And so we just wanted to make everybody aware of this planned program because we know a lot of stakeholders here would be interested in it. Next slide, please. So I wanted to take a few minutes now to walk through what the planned timeline would be for the co-design. So after selecting participants for the co-design, we would then hold a kickoff meeting where all the participants can meet each other and we walk through kind of what the detailed timeline is. And what I think is the most important activity for that session is we would collectively decide on community agreements and a consensus process in decision-making throughout the co-design. The next phase of the co-design will be trainings. We anticipate that many of the selected co-design participants will have varying levels of experience in how solar development works in New York State. So we'll be conducting trainings on relevant topics so that all co-design participants can enter the issue identification phase with equal levels of understanding. So several of the planned topics that we will be doing in the trainings include how solar is financed, how solar is sited, how interconnection works, and then we'll actually leave 2 sessions open for the co-design participants to tell us what topics they want to learn to help inform them for the next phase of the co-design. After the trainings, we would dive right into an issue identification. We're actually partnering with Hester Street on this effort. And the objective for the issue identification is to really explore, understand, and summarize the issues that are impeding the development of community-led and community-owned solar in New York. Next slide, please. Oh, great, perfect. So after the issue identification phase, we will move right into solution development. We will be working with the co-designers and the co-design participants, and NYSERDA will collaborate on identifying what possible solutions there are for the issues that came up in the issue identification phase. The co-design participants in NYSERDA will also work together to draft a solutions brief that contains proposals on how to support community-led and/or community-owned solar in underserved communities in New York. So the solution development phase is actually broken into 2 phases. So for the second part of it, we will actually then take that solutions brief that we developed in collaboration with the co-designers, and we'll actually share that with the public and gather input and feedback through NYSERDA's request for information process. So if an entity, for whatever reason, is not participating in the co-design process, there's still an opportunity for them to review and provide feedback to the suggested solutions. And then the final phase is program development and release, where NYSERDA will take that solutions brief, the comments and feedback from the RFI process, and actually develop a final program that supports community-led solar in the state of New York. We just wanted to take an opportunity to present to everybody, you know, the fact that we are planning on doing this co-design effort this year, and this is our planned, you know, process during the co-design. And as I mentioned before, we're releasing this co-design in collaboration with NYSERDA's Energy and Climate Equity team, and at this time, it's anticipated for spring of 2022. So before we move into Q&A, I just actually wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that this co-design idea did not come initially from NYSERDA. It actually came from feedback that we received from stakeholders. So this is really an example of how we are listening to our stakeholders, and we will continue to listen. We just greatly appreciate your partnership as we build out more equitable solar programs in New York. And so please keep the feedback coming, and I look forward to hearing all the feedback during the Q&A. So with that, next slide, please. And I will hand it back to Luke and Max, and we will kick off the Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. We're just going to take a few minutes and go over the Q&A. We've been reviewing most of the questions, and we will take turns answering them.
So I can start to answer some questions related to the co-design that I see. There's one question on how will the participants for the co-design program will be selected. We can't share that right now. Know that we're developing criteria in collaboration with the Energy and Climate Equity team. But once the program is announced, we will be hosting a webinar where we talk through what the eligibility and participation, the eligibility and qualification requirements are. There's another question is, will co-design participants be compensated? Yes, we are planning on compensating co-design participants that qualify.
Jump in with a question real quick about the multifamily affordable housing adder in Con Ed. The question is, with the community credit expiring in Con Ed, is the multifamily affordable the housing adder revert to $2 a watt automatically? That $2 per watt incentive for multifamily affordable housing adder in Con Ed, which was changed last fall, is for all community solar projects that are eligible multifamily affordable housing that will not receive the community credit. So that is planned to continue.
I'll take a few questions. So the first question is essentially, what would the incentive payout structure be for these proposed new incentives? So we're proposing no change in the incentive payout structure. So yes, a Con Edison project would get 100% of its incentive and incentive adders at permission to operate. And upstate commercial industrial projects would get 50% of the project at permission to operate, 25% at the end of year 1, and 25% at the end of year 2. Next question, would the megawatt block incentives decline over time? I'd say yes, we are essentially planning on the incentive megawatt blocks declining over time. That's been a long-standing element of the New York Sun program. That being said, we are aware that the federal ITC is most likely stepping down in the future. So what we're doing is essentially taking a look at the project, at the revenue required to make a project pencil out for any given year, and then we will use that to set the incentive block for that respective market segment. This is an ongoing process. We know that there are a lot of changing elements in the solar industry. Import tariffs, commodity prices, module prices, cost of labor, cost of interconnection. So NYSERDA and DPS are committed to constantly reevaluating those project costs and project revenues and using that to set the incentives. We typically like to set 1 or 2 incentive block rates at a time, so developers and installers know, what the incentive will be for the short term. But we do want to reserve, the right to have flexibility in the medium and long term. There was another question essentially saying, if a project right now reserves 20 cents per watt in the Con Ed non-residential incentive, is that project boxed out of future incentives? I'd encourage you to take a look at the exact wording we have in the roadmap because it's a little bit different for Upstate and Con Ed. We don't want to stop development cold in Con Ed, so we have this language. I'm going to read you a quote. Con Edison non-residential projects that apply to the New York Sun program subsequent to the filing of this roadmap, as well as Con Ed non-residential projects that submitted applications to the current block, Block 10, and were not previously awarded the community credit, may, subject to an authorizing commission order, opt into the new incentive structure. So we're essentially saying, yes, you can lock in the current incentive, and if a better one comes around for Con Ed non-residential, you could essentially upgrade that incentive amount. So again, that precise wording is in the roadmap. I'd encourage you to take a look at that section. But we are trying to encourage development between now and if and when the roadmap is approved. And I'll pass the mic to the next person to take the next question.
We have a question here. Oh, whoops, I lost where I was. Is the co-design for community-owned solar process the same as PON 3414, affordable solar and storage pre-development and technical assistance? That it actually is a great question. It's going to be a completely different program and a completely different process. As I mentioned before, once we release this program, we will have a webinar that discusses kind of the details on how to participate in that program.
I can, this is Max Jilgan. I can jump in on two questions I see that are related. First question, was there any consideration of an incentive adder for co-location of ag and solar, often referred to as agrivoltaics? And also, are there any plans to offer an incentive for floating solar? So the answer is that both of those things are under consideration. The roadmap doesn't go into details there, but does talk about the importance of encouraging alternative siting practices. Those are both good areas for comments specifically to agrivoltaics. That one has been an active topic with our agriculture technical working group. That group is also referenced and described in the roadmap. As part of that group, we're really looking to have good definitions of what kind of agricultural and solar practices should be encouraged and potentially make sense to incentivize.
There's a question of how do you determine the income eligibility of residents in DAC communities? We actually do that in collaboration with our energy, climate, and equity team. They're really the experts on the income eligibility and also on kind of what are the criteria that identify a DAC community. And at NYSERDA, we want to make sure there aren't too many different types of ways to define that. So we're just lined up with them.
Hi, this is Max again. So a new question. NYC/Con Ed territory has barriers of higher labor and land costs and many New York City projects stuck in development. Shouldn't there be a higher solar roadmap goal in New York City to address the inequitable solar development? Is there documented data on the latest increase in material cost due to supply chain issues for 2021, 2022? Separate question but from the same person, for SEIF eligibility, it seems to be predominantly tied to income versus demographics. People of color are more likely to be exposed to pollution and environmental injustices regardless of income. So I'll start with the last one. That is correct. The have individual eligibility criteria we've had for the SEIF programs to date. Well, specifically the rooftop residential program, that is purely income based. The community solar program, the ICSA, does incorporate that disadvantaged communities criteria to an extent. However, this is, again, a really great area for comment. So if if sort of your perspective is that say residents in a disadvantaged community should be automatically qualifying for say the community solar program, the ICSA, that's really important feedback. And as noted in the presentation, when we established the SEIF, we didn't even have the interim DAC definitions. So now with the final DACs coming online, it seems like a very good time to re-examine how those things connect. So going to New York City costs and allocations under the plan. So we did indeed take very seriously the higher costs in the Con Ed territory. That of course is why you're seeing kind of the for some types of projects 5x incentive levels compared to Upstate. So on a funding level committed in the budget, I think we take the perspective that this plan does address the kind of the needs of the New York City market and even the historical balance between funding to upstate projects and New York City projects. However, because of exactly those higher funding needs, the capacity, the watts DC in the roadmap for New York City are significantly lower than upstate. So that, in our analysis, reflects both some budget considerations, but also development realities, available roofs and space to develop in the, of course, much smaller land area of New York City versus upstate New York. And then the sort of specific question about is there documented data on the latest increases in material costs? The answer is yes. There's on the kind of public available data side, Department of Energy and NREL have published some good data on that, and then there's some sort of like commercially available data as well. We didn't, that data was becoming available about the same time as we did the analysis, so it was somewhat, where available, it was incorporated into the analysis, but of course that has been changing very rapidly, even month to month. Luke, is there anything you'd like to add to that on the New York City Con Ed considerations in particular?
No, I mean, Max, I think you hit it on the nail on the head when you said that, siting is difficult and problematic, and it's challenging to really scale up deployment in Con Ed to the levels we've seen upstate.
Just jumping in here, there's a question about the affordable solar residential incentive. That's the low to moderate income incentive for single family residential projects, which is currently at 80 cents a watt. The reason why it's at that level is it initially was tied to the megawatt block residential incentive, and it would double that incentive. And in order to provide more planning continuity, we locked it in at a certain rate independent of the step down of the megawatt block. There are no proposed larger changes in the roadmap, although we would welcome those comments. I can say that independent of that, we are exploring ways to increase the number of projects and improve overall processing of applications for the incentive.
I guess I'll jump back in and you know, as you folks may be sort of gathering, we're really trying to prioritize the questions related to the SEIF, and I know there's a lot of kind of more functional questions coming in about other parts of the roadmap. We will get to them. Thank you for your patience. So here's a great kind of big picture one. If NYSERDA sees that solar development is misaligned with the CPA goals, will NYSERDA reallocate funding from base incentives to SEIF LMI adders? So I'm assuming that's, you know, really meant the CLCPA, you know, mandate, not goal, for 40% benefits to disadvantaged communities. I mean, the answer is yes, of course. That if our planning turns out to be you know, very wrong, and we aren't able to you know, meet our goals with the plan if it is approved, you know, we would, I believe, basically repeat this process. You know, reevaluate the programs, and if necessary, file a new petition. However, you know, I'll just say I have a you know, a pretty high level of confidence in the proposal for the SEIF in this roadmap, you know, in part based on the performance of the SEIF to date. So of course our I think everyone's you know, first choice would be to you know, complete this part of the roadmap process. We have the, you know, the roadmap filed by DPS and NYSERDA. It's going through this, you know, very robust public comment process, and I know there'll be some really good detailed comments related to the SEIF that the commission can, you know, take into consideration and potentially make alterations to the proposed plan. With all that done, I have confidence that we'll end up with a product that is very much, you know, we can all have confidence we'll meet the CPA goals, but yeah, there's always room for adjustment.
We have a question here. Is the co-designed project limited to be physically located within the community's physical boundaries? I think you're asking about, like, when we do decide on the program that's designed through co-design, you know, what are going to be the physical limits there? That's actually a topic that will be part of the co-design effort. So when we're doing the issue identification and the solutions development, absolutely the geographic kind of considerations and limitations would be part of that co-design. You know, it's not something that NYSERDA is necessarily deciding on, you know, what type of projects are going to be part of community-led solar development, what could possibly get funded. That's all going to be worked out through the co-design effort.
Right, I see a couple more questions about the SEIF. One is just confirming that the proposed program requirements would be a minimum of 10% credit discount to each residential off-taker for SEIF project. That's correct. That is the proposal, and that is the current rule for the inclusive community solar program. Another question, how are the New York Sun team and New York Green Bank aligning efforts to meet the equitable investment mandates of the CLCPA and the equity goals in the roadmap? So that's a great question. I think the Green Bank's role is touched on at kind of a high level in the roadmap. What I can point to date, probably most prominently, has been the Green Bank's role in financing community solar and moving the community solar financing model away from one that places a kind of a hard emphasis on FICO scores in particular. I think we saw kind of early financing in the space, really looking at that as the model, and certainly NYSERDA and the Green Bank, and I think most people in the industry, and as well as advocates, really disagreed with that perspective for community solar. The Green Bank, through their really influential underwriting terms for community solar, I think led the way in reducing or eliminating those requirements, and frankly, we've all been proven right. Every data point coming out of community solar in New York and elsewhere shows that those really restrictive credit criteria are necessary and pointless, and probably hurt the economics of the project by limiting potential customers. So I'd underscore that as a kind of example of how New York Sun and the Green Bank have worked together. We're certainly planning to continue to work together, and I'm sure there's a lot of other areas and deeper areas that many of the stakeholders would like us to look at. And another great point that I'd encourage folks to raise in their comments.
We have a question about, will a written Q&A be provided after these webinars? We are going to be producing an FAQ document that will have kind of the most common questions from this webinar and then the webinar on Tuesday. There won't necessarily be a written Q&A of every single question on here, but we are recording this webinar, and so you'll be able to go back and see kind of whatever we said for this specific webinar. There's another question of, can you tell us how you're defining community-led and community-owned solar for the co-design program? That's going to really come out through the co-design process. Our plan is to just bring together a group of co-designers to help us build this new program, for the state, or for underserved communities. And as far as the parameters of like what we would consider community led, what would we be considering community owned, that would be worked out as part of the co-design. We have another question. Would NYSERDA consider changing the incentives to better support community-owned and democratically controlled solar based on the results of the co-design effort? Has any incentive funding been set aside for this purpose? I'd love more clarity on the second question, but at least for the first question, The current goal of the co-design is to build a program to support community-owned solar and community-led solar. Anything else that might result from that, that I think is something that we will just kind of figure out through the process. The current goal is just developing one program, how it affects the other incentives. I think that's absolutely something we can have as part of the co-design effort, a point of discussion as part of the co-design effort.
This is Luke. I think we've run through most of the SEIF questions. I'm going to take some of the sort of miscellaneous questions here. There is a question about how exactly that 1 megawatt AC cap for prevailing wage will work. Essentially, can you have two smaller projects on the same parcel and effectively dodge that prevailing wage requirements? The answer is that really depends on the wording of any resulting order in the New York Sun implementation plan. If you have questions, or I'm sorry, if you have comments about how those prevailing wage requirements, should exactly be worded, that would be a great item to comment on. Another question on when are these incentives expected to be unveiled to developers? We showed everything we possibly could on this slide deck regarding base incentive, community adder, prevailing wage adder. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those figures that were shown on the slide deck once we get those posted. There's a question on incentives for battery energy storage. The distributed solar roadmap was hyper-focused on solar PV as a technology, so it does not recommend any incentives for battery storage. That being said, there will be a storage roadmap forthcoming in the coming year. It's at a very early stage of development, but that will address, a larger storage goal for New York State. To clarify, the current prevailing wage requirement is 5 megawatts AC. So if you're installing a project below 5 megawatts AC, there is not currently a prevailing wage requirement, unless, of course, you're installing on public land or for a public entity. So right now, there is not prevailing wage under 5 megawatts. In the roadmap recommends that 5 megawatt cap be essentially reduced to 1 megawatt. All incentives we discussed today were in dollars per watt DC, including that prevailing wage adder. I know we're being a little bit tricky by putting a dollar per watt DC incentive on prevailing wage, which would apply to projects 1 megawatt AC and smaller, but all incentives were essentially in dollars per watt DC. So I know we're at time. It's 2:30. I'll ask my colleagues if they want to take any last questions here. Everything we don't get to today will be addressed in that FAQ document that Sarah mentioned.
Luke, I don't have any other questions. I know we have more questions coming in, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. If you do have questions, feel free to email community solar at NYSERDA.ny.gov. That is where we are cataloging and taking in questions related to the 10 gigawatt roadmap and also questions related to anything you heard around the solar energy equity framework and the planned co-design of community-led
Take a new
solar.
one that's come in about the SEIF. The question is the LMI incentive designed to offset the LMI subscriber acquisition costs, or is it to provide an incentive to developers? And I think that's in reference to the inclusive community solar adder. So this, for the purpose of the roadmap, this kind of analysis is described there. It is targeted to one, offset potential higher LMI subscriber acquisition management costs, and two, enable the minimum 10% cost savings. It is not directly meant to be a motivator for developers, more of a enabler of business models that can include LMI subscribers. And I'm just looking at our list. Shyam, are you able to unmute and maybe go on a run? There's a few questions that you'd selected.
Sure, Max. Can folks hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Great. So this is Shyam Mehta from the NYSERDA team. Just we'll take a stab at answering motley crew of questions from the list, which will still leave a number of questions that we won't be able to get to. But just quickly, I think Luke already touched on this. Luke already touched, just confirming that that folks can hear me. Okay, I think the answer to that is yes. So just adding a little bit more color on a question I think Luke answered previously, which is that the roadmap states that prevailing wage only applies to projects above 1 megawatt AC. If a project is being developed for a municipality that requires prevailing wage but is below 1 megawatt AC, can developers receive the prevailing wage adder? So the answer to that question is not as proposed in the roadmap. However, again, this is a kind of a perfunctory response here, but if developers or if a developer or any other stakeholder does feel that such an adder is necessary for sub megawatt, 1 megawatt projects that are required to pay prevailing wage, we encourage you to put in comments in the docket to that effect. There's a question on interconnection, which is, will the SIR, which is the Standardized Interconnection Review, and the CSER studies anticipate a forward view of the additional 4 gigawatts of solar in a manner that minimizes generation pockets and the need for a reactive PSC order to interconnect? So that's quite that's a good question. I would say that there are two responses there. One is there is an ongoing regulatory proceeding 20-E-0197 relating to necessary transmission and distribution system investments to following the passage of the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefits Act. And so that proceeding was set up, I believe, in May 2020 to advance planning processes and investments that are necessary to realize our CLCPA goals, and includes distribution system and local transmission investments. So that is one avenue by which this matter is being advanced. And on top of that, the roadmap does have additional recommendations on interconnection and distribution system investment policies that are necessary to ensure that distribution level hosting capacity is expanded in a way that enables the realization of the incremental 4 gigawatt target. So I would point folks to both that 20-E-0197 proceeding, as well as the distribution system investment recommendation section of the roadmap, and absolutely encourage stakeholders to provide comments as part of the roadmap filing comment process with regard to those recommendations, because we do recognize that that interconnection and hosting capacity hosting capacity is a fundamental constraint when it comes to realizing the incremental 4 gigawatt goal. Then one more question about why LIPA and PSEG Long Island runs a different incentive program. and how they would propose to make up the incentive budget from non-NYSERDA funds. So the answer there is that LIPA customers do not pay into the Clean Energy Fund, which funds New York Sun, and LIPA is not under direct jurisdiction of the DPS or PSC. So we've made the point in the roadmap that when it comes to LIPA's target of 560 megawatts as part of the incremental 4 gigawatt target, if it happens that further or additional incentives are needed to achieve that target, the LIPA specific target, additional non-CEF support would need to be identified there. And I think I'll stop there just because we are 8 minutes over. So there is a fairly long list of questions that we were unfortunately not able to get to. Sarah, I'll defer to you on how we're planning on tackling those and responding to that list if you could.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shyam. You know, we have a ton of questions that have come in. Thank you so much for kind of your continued feedback and engagement. So we're going to be taking these questions I had mentioned earlier, and we're going to be turning them into a frequently asked questions document. So expect that in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us through the Community Solar inbox. So that's communitysolar@nyserda.ny.gov. You know, our team checks that, you know, every day, really regularly. And if we don't respond to your question immediately, it's probably because we're adding it to the FAQ document so that we can, you know, have a response that everybody can see. I think with that, I don't have anything else, Max or Luke or anyone else on the call. If we don't have anything else, I think we can end things.
Nothing for me, Sarah.
Hey, this is Warren Myers with the Department of Public Service. I just want to encourage people to, you know, file your formal comments. You don't have to wait till the last day. You don't have to each file individual comments if you have similar interests and similar opinions. Consolidating your comments and making them as clear and straightforward as possible will really help us. The amount some have asked about, you know, the turnaround time, when it might get to the commission, that's all dependent on the volume of comments and the complexity of comments and suggestions we receive by March 7th. So it serves everybody, it serves the record if people can try to consolidate comments and make them as clearly and directly as possible. But please file your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Warren. So I'll just take a minute. Sal, do you mind going to slide 11, just so everybody can see what that process is for filing your comments? And I think, as Warren said, the comments really do have play a really important role. They do have an impact in kind of what this proposed plan is. It's the petition, how it actually kind of evolves into the order. So please file your comments. We really do read them, and we really do take them, you know, take them seriously. So I think with that, I'll just let this stay up for 1 second. And then I think with that, we can close it out. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all.